Well, good morning. It's been a while since I've done a sermon outside like this, and I thought a good place to start the sermon at least would be here at Parliament House, because we're in a pretty unusual moment right now. We're in a moment where we're asking a lot of our political leaders. We're asking them to sort out a world that seems to be going a bit mad, a world that has wars happening, petrol prices going through the roof, the cost of living exploding, and a lot of the fundamental democratic institutions that we kind of assumed were stable and here for the long term seem to be melting away. And so one of the questions is, how do we make sense of all that, and what kind of leadership should we be looking for from our political leaders, but also from within the church? We started this mini sermon series that I'm calling How We, with the capital W, capital E, bless, last week when we started talking about the church and how our assumptions about the church, how our expectations of the church have been shaped by two forces. Our history over 2,000 years that has shaped the church, but also strongly by our culture. And today I actually want to look at how our culture and our history have shaped our expectations of leadership, and how potentially the Bible talks about leadership in quite a different way than our expectations of leadership might be. So let's dive in. To start with, I want to talk about power. And a lot of what I'll be talking about today is about power and influence. And we want to face the fact that from the very start of the Bible, there is this tendency that we as human beings have to want to be in control, ultimate control of our own lives, and just to be able to do what we want to do. In fact, our culture says that's when you've made it. You've made it when you've got enough money or enough authority to do what you want to do. But imagine for a minute a society where everybody was just doing what they want to do. How effective do you think that society would be? What would it be like to be in it? See, the Bible helps us imagine a reality like that, because in the book of Judges, that's exactly what was happening. In the book of Judges, it says everybody was doing that which was right in their own eyes. Our culture says that's kind of what we need to aspire for. The book of Judges is a pretty dark story of what happens when that's true. And we need to work out, how do we make sure we don't devolve into a world like that, where everybody's just doing that which is right in their own eyes? The world has its answer to that kind of devolution, and it's power. It's people in authority. Jesus talks about that kind of authority when he says, you know, the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. There's a sense in which the way that human societies manage the human tendency to want to just do my own thing is we end up putting people in charge. In Tasmania, though, a lot of those people sit behind me in Parliament House, but in other countries I've been to, like for instance in Mexico, sadly in some of the communities I was at, those authorities are actually gang leaders. Throughout human history there are different authorities, and some of them have been terrifying, some of them hopefully have been good, but we need authorities. In fact, the book of Romans says, the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers don't bear the sword for no reason. They're God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment to the wrongdoer. Now, this is an interesting chapter. A lot of people have wrestled with what Paul is saying here, and some people would want to say, well, that's only true of good governments. But did you realize that what Paul is writing about, the government Paul is writing about here, is the Emperor Nero? He, by any measure, is not what we would call a good government. In fact, he ends up leading significant oppression of Christians. But there is this sense that in a broken world where ultimately we understand we're a bit sinful and we are a bit selfish, human beings do need authorities and wrongdoing does need to be punished. And so there is this sense that we need governments. And Romans 13 talks about governments who are able to punish wrongdoing. The danger, though, is that we think that's how ultimately wrongdoing is defeated. We think that's how evil is defeated. That's the basis of every Marvel movie, that you get really tough people who beat up the bad guys. Sociologically that's called the myth of redemptive violence. And Jesus actually speaks directly to this when Peter, as he's surrounded by the Romans, pulls out his sword and declares war on the whole Roman Empire. And Jesus looks at him and says, and sort of I think with a bit of a shake of the head says, Peter, put it away. Don't you know those who live by the sword will die by the sword? We live in a moment, at the moment where it seems as though in world politics, we're devolving a bit to the idea that might makes right. That's not a new idea. That's been a kind of a theme throughout human history. But we have seen over and over again that might really doesn't make right. I was born in 1971, which means I graduated grade 12 in 1989, the year that the Berlin Wall fell down. And as I was growing up, there was just a genuine fear of global nuclear war. I lived through my formative years in the Cold War. And there was a song that sort of came to typify it. I remember the first time I heard it, I was walking to wood class in St Anne's and Gippsland Grammar in Sale in Victoria, and there's just something about the lyrics of the song that spoke to my heart, and I think spoke to the heart of a generation. The song was called Russians by Sting. And see if this sounds as though it speaks to our moment at all for you. This is Sting's lyrics. This is sort of halfway through the song. There is no monopoly on common sense on either side of the political fence. We share the same biology, regardless of ideology.
Believe me when I say to you, I hope the Russians love their children too.
There is no historical precedent.
To put the words in the mouth of the president.
And this is the line that it's been going through my head when I've been hearing leaders in America talk recently.
There's no such thing as a winnable war. It's a lie we don't believe anymore.
I'm actually wondering whether we've got too far away from the Cold War now and we've forgotten the truth of that there really is no such thing as a winnable war. It is a lie we shouldn't believe. But too quickly we get sucked into this myth of redemptive violence. And we think it's the job of the politicians to beat up the bad guys on our behalf, and that's how we will achieve peace. Well, the New Testament doesn't talk a lot about when Christians should go to war or not, because it was just as far from possible as it's hard to imagine. The Christian church in the New Testament was a tiny little minority, a weak little minority, and kind of the glimpses we get when Peter pulls his sword out and Jesus responds in the way he does, or in that verse we talked about in Romans 13. Later on, though, Christian thinkers wrestled with when is it right to go to war? How does it work? And For those who are looking on the sermon notes on the web page, which you can find just by going to the Citywide web page and clicking on Connect and Sermons, there is actually a list there of the headings of what comes to be called just war theory. Thinkers like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas wrestled with this question because they had to advise governments about when is it right to go to war, when is it right to beat up the bad guys. And they came up with a whole set of criteria for what it would mean for a government trying to follow Jesus to go to war. And they ultimately, the theme behind what they said, you'll see there's a bunch of stuff there, but one of the themes behind it, that all war should be fought on the basis of seeking to bring about greater justice and better care for those you are going to war against, which is something we're not hearing a lot about. But I do think one of the things, as we live in a world where we're hearing a lot about anti-Semitism, we're hearing about Islamophobia, we're hearing a lot about the fracturing of our society, we do need to watch that there is part of us that is tempted to dehumanize people who don't look or sound or think like us. And you can't do that as a follower of Jesus. Jesus is really clear. He actually says, if you look at someone and call them a fool, you're in serious danger of repercussions, whenever you look at someone and don't take them seriously. In fact, what he says is, you are to love your enemies. Now, just war theory and some of what Jesus was saying earlier, sometimes, it sounds a bit counterintuitive, but sometimes the loving thing to do is actually to stand up and go to war, or to stand up against a bully. That is the loving thing to do, because being a bully doesn't help the bully. It is actually ultimately sometimes the right thing to do to stand up. But there is this danger that we can believe that is the path to peace, that violence is the path to peace. And it's simply not true. Christians, in a world that requires coercive force and governments to use coercive force, Christians are actually meant to be a counterculture that points to a different kind of power. Jesus, remember, talked about how authority works, that the rulers of the Gentiles exercise authority over them. He then looks into the eyes of his disciples and he says, not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. We are called to operate not with the view that somehow we've got to get tough enough to beat up the bad guys. We are called to think about a different kind of power, a power based on service and love. And the Christian church is meant to be a counterculture, a group of people who act and respond differently and who see authority differently. It is really tempting to think that the problems in the world are all caused by evil people, and that if we could get rid of the evil people, if we could get rid of the people who are taking the wrong kind of power and putting it in the wrong kind of direction, then we would solve all the problems of the world. That's the idea that was at the heart of Marxism, that somehow the oppressed people, if they could just defeat the oppressors, then everything would be okay. The problem with that is there is a core Christian understanding that is also one of the understandings I think that we often forget as the church, and it is this, that we are all a bit broken. A man who was right at the heart of the Marxist revolution was a man by the name of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and you've heard me quote him before. He ends up writing this Gulag Archipelago, and as we think about authority and power, I think it's really important for us to understand that the Christian way of seeing these things is that, as he says, if only there were evil people somewhere who somehow were causing all the bad things to be happening, somehow, he says, insidiously committing evil deeds, and it was necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But as he points out, the line dividing good and evil isn't between people. It runs down the center of every human heart. And if you really want to divide evil, get rid of evil, then you have to get rid of your own heart. And who wants to do that? That is the core understanding that the Bible brings to this whole discussion of what kind of leadership do we need. And that is, I think, why Paul writes, though we live in the world, and he's talking about followers of Jesus here, not everybody, we don't wage war as the world does. So it's important for us to hear that. If you are becoming a bigger bully in order to beat up the bullies, you're in danger of trying to wage war as the world does. Paul says, no, as followers of Jesus, we're actually called to do things pretty differently. He says, the weapons we fight with aren't bombs. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And we take captive every thought. What he's saying is the real battle is the battle for people's hearts and minds. It's the battle for what we believe to be true. And there is this real danger that we think that the real battle is out there, when for all of us, the real battle we face, the real struggle we are in, is a struggle that gets to our own hearts. And so you get this sense that Christians we live in the world, and we need governments who will punish wrongdoing, because not everybody is going to be seeking to follow Jesus, even inside the church. But we are called to a different kind of way, a different set of priorities. The honest truth is, power, the idea that you can do what you want, is a really seductive idea. I mean, if I'm to be honest, I would love to be free just to do what I felt like doing. I would love to be able to buy what I wanted to buy, go where I wanted to go, have a day off when I wanted to have a day off. Wouldn't you love that? Power. The idea that you can do what you want to do, that's a seductive idea. And I even think Jesus found it tempting. We have the story, of course, where Satan directly tempts Jesus, but we have this other moment where Jesus has been on a journey with the disciples, and he gets to a point where he asks them, who do people say I am? And eventually Peter says, you're the Messiah. And it's almost like this look of relief comes across his face. And then we have this little story. From that time on, it was almost like Jesus had been waiting for them to say that. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. And that he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life. Now, Peter is pretty sure that the kingdom he's part of is a redemptive violence kingdom, a kingdom where the bigger bullies beat up the bullies. So he's looking forward to being in control. And this is not the story he believes. So he says, hey, Jesus, come over here. No, it doesn't have to be like that. He says, this won't ever happen to you, not while I'm around. And I think this is one of Jesus' strongest moments, as he looks into Peter's eyes and says, get behind me, Satan. It's pretty strong, don't you think? And he says, you're a stumbling block to me. So he's actually saying there's part of me, Peter, that would love what you're saying to be true. I've got a road ahead of me that there's part of me that would much prefer not to take. And we see that in the Garden of Gethsemane. He says to Peter, you don't have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. And so here we get to the crux of things. We need to examine our understanding of what power is meant to be for people who want to follow Jesus. Jesus goes directly on and says what it's meant to be. He says, whoever wants to be my disciple, they've got to deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their own soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their own soul? He's repeating here what he has previously said in chapter 10, where he says, whoever doesn't take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. Jesus is directly countermanding what our society says is true. Our society says you will find happiness if you follow what you want to do and do what you want to do. Jesus is saying, follow what you want to do and you'll end up losing your life. This is the heart of a Christian understanding of a different way of life. That I think we get a bit nervous about talking about sin. And when we do, we end up pointing our fingers at people outside the church and talk about how terrible it is. That's actually not a biblical way to do things. We need to love people outside the church, but we need to be ready to have the hard conversations within the church about the stuff that robs us of life. Jesus is actually pretty direct when it comes to facing sin. He says, if your brother or sister sins, go to them and point out their fault. You see, for Jesus, he understands the stuff where we are pursuing our own agenda, the stuff where we are choosing to live life outside the boundaries that are actually the key to life, is actually going to rob us of life. And it is not loving not to be confronting. It is not loving not to be honest with each other. He says, if they listen to you, you've won them over. But if they don't listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Now, Jesus has just talked about leaving the 99 and following the one. Christians are called to love pagans and tax collectors, but they're not called to let pagans and tax collectors influence their way of seeing the world. I actually think, as I travel around the state, and as I was saying this last week, one of the greatest challenges we've had in the church, in the Baptist church in Tasmania, is that we haven't managed conflict well, and we haven't addressed sin well. One of the challenges, though, in a world that's pretty confusing, how on earth do you know what is right, what is wrong? This is where we come to a passage in the Bible that I think is largely misunderstood and is completely confronting, because I'm not sure if we're ready for it, to be honest with you. Well, Jesus says, after he has talked about confronting sin, he says this, truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. In that, he's actually quoting word for word what he said previously to Peter in Matthew chapter 16. But then he says this word again. And so he's saying, what I have just said, I'm going to put it in a different way. He says, truly I tell you that if 2 of you agree about anything they ask for, it'll be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there am I with them. So it's clear when he's talking about binding and loosing, he's not just giving Peter that authority. He's actually saying, no, this is something that the church needs to do together in fellowship. And I spent a lot of time in the Foundations course unpacking this verse particularly. But one of the things I think we need to hear here is what Jesus is talking about. He's actually giving the church responsibility to work out what is right and what is wrong. He's actually saying, and there is a genius in what he's doing here, because he understands culture changes. And in times and places, the church, in order to be faithful to Jesus, will put prohibitions around things and say that Christians don't do this. And then in other times and places, in other cultures, they'll do things differently. So there was a time, I don't know if you can believe this, where Baptists didn't dance. There was a time where you didn't play cards, because in that time and that place, the church had wrestled with and said, no, this is stuff we don't do. And we get to a point where we can have one of two responses to trying to work out what can we do, what shouldn't we do, how does authority and sin work. We can be conservative, and a conservative is, particularly a conservative church, is a church that foregoes their responsibility to bind and loose and work out what it means to be faithful in this moment, and says, we'll just do whatever our grandparents did, and we'll hold on to the past. The opposite of that is a progressive approach, which says, well, again, we're going to forego our binding and loosing responsibility, and what we're going to do is say, you just do what you feel like doing. It is never right for the church just to hang on to the past, or to say, yeah, you just do what you feel like doing. By the way, if you want to investigate the meaning of what Jesus is saying here, for those who are looking on the webpage, I've got two quotes from commentaries about the nature of the binding and loosing. And it is just clear that the church is responsible to set parameters around the kind of behaviour that is morally acceptable. But this is where we've got to face some stuff. The truth is, if we are being called to trust the church to tell us what's right and wrong, if we look back on the history of church, and even for some of our experience of church, sometimes the church has been anything but full of grace and truth. Sometimes the church has done damage when it sees people who are acting in ways it would consider immoral. So sometimes the church hasn't been worthy of trust. What this requires is a church that is worthy of people's trust, and people who are courageous enough to push through the shame and be honest about the messy stuff. And you see how authority is meant to work in the church. It is meant to be a collaborative effort. Authority in the church is meant to be something that builds fellowship, not builds subservience. Instead of redemptive violence, we are called to redemptive love. This is the heart of what it's all about. Jesus says that the central commandment is love God and love your neighbour as yourself. He actually says, a new command I give you, love each other, and on the basis of your love, people will know that who I am and who you are, that you truly are my disciples. There's something powerful. We're meant to live differently when it comes to power and authority. I think Martin Luther King said it well when he said, to meet hate with retaliatory hate would do nothing but intensify the existence of evil in the universe. Hate begets hate. Violence begets violence. Toughness begets a greater toughness. We must meet the forces of hate with the power of love. We must meet physical force with soul force. Do you get that? Yeah, we do need governments, we need courts, we need ways of dealing with a broken world where people are sinful, and I love that the idea of democracy is that ultimately you can't completely trust any one person, so we're better doing that together. We have different wings of government. I think that is the closest to the biblical model. But But church is meant to be different to all of that. It is meant to be this voluntary association who know that we are loved by Jesus, and because of that we love each other, and we live not on the basis of who gets to be the boss, but who gets to be the servant. Today we're celebrating Palm Sunday. On Palm Sunday, Jesus came as a different kind of king. It says in Matthew chapter 21 that Jesus getting the donkey happened in order to fulfill the words of the prophet who says, "See, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey." Peter wanted a different kind of kingdom, a kingdom where the bullies that were on his side beat up the bullies who were on other people's side. But Jesus comes as a different kind of king, a gentle king, a king of love, and invites us to a different way. Now, I don't know how you hear all this, but I actually think in all this, we have been shaped by a world that says the most important thing is you do what you want, and find, if there's bad things in the world, find bullies to beat up the bullies. It's clear that the Bible is calling us to a different way, a way based on love. And it is calling us to be a different kind of group of people. I think we've largely ignored the commands about confronting sin in each other and loving each other enough to be honest and speaking the truth in love, going up into Him who is the head, submitting ourselves to each other, all that stuff. I think we tend to ignore. But we're called, I think, to take Jesus seriously. And I wonder, would you be willing to work with the rest of us, to help us be the kind of church that is worthy of people's trust? I wonder, can we trust Jesus enough that when it feels like the whole world's imploding, we don't then quickly start trying to organise ourselves to look after ourselves, but rather seek what it means to love others? Whenever the church has been at its worst, it's been focused on itself. Whenever it's been at its best, it has loved the people outside the church. I love that when the great plagues came, many Christians, rather than running away, went to care. We're in an unstable moment as a country. And it is tempting right now to be stockpiling petrol and getting tins of food and all that sort of stuff. But whereas I think this is a moment to, not pretend that bad things aren't happening, but work out what does it mean for us to be people who love and who actually operate differently, who actually, when things are becoming uncertain, don't stockpile toilet paper, but try to love our neighbours. What does it mean to be people who live from a different kind of power and authority? Today we've been examining our expectations of power and authority and how they've shaped us, and I do think this is another area, just as our picture of church probably needs a bit of correction, I wonder if this is an area that needs correction. I might just pray for us, will I? So Jesus, help. We often have wrong pictures of what it means to bring peace to the world. Often we can think that we can bring peace by dealing with bad guys, by beating them up. Help us be open to a different way. Help us be open to your way, a different way of love, a power of love rather than power of coercion. We recognise we really need your help with this. I pray for my brothers and sisters. Help us know what it means not to become self-focused, but to become love-focused. As Martin Luther King said, let's not try and defeat the powers of evil with greater evil, but with soul power, with love power. Help us work out what that actually means, Jesus, I pray. Amen.